Welcome to tonight's talk by Gavin Van Horn and to our year-long series, Re-envisioning Nature, an Environmental Humanities Lecture Series. Tonight's program will start with a short video about the humanities at URI.
We are facing problems and challenges that do not have easy, simple, finite solutions. Machines are going to be doing so much stuff for us. The only things that are going to be left are the things that only human brains can do. And those kinds of things are taught by the arts and humanities.
Studying the humanities, studying literature, drama, art, performance, what that feeds in a student is possibility.
The University of Rhode Island is a really good place to pursue one's interests in an environment of opportunities. That engagement, in some way, shape, or form, becomes in part the definition of the university experience.
Every area of the humanities trains you to investigate, explore. If you want to lead, you have to have a broad, interdisciplinary, open-minded approach to the world.
Exploration is the foundation of everything that we do. You have to be able to think beyond the circumstances you're presently in. The critical thinking, the language skills, reasoning abilities, those are the ways that you can build a bridge between what you did before and what you can do in the future.
The skills students learn in the humanities are skills that they will take into every aspect of their future life, both personal and professional.
The problems that we have facing us are complicated issues that require people who move across disciplines, think creatively, think deeply. That's something that humanities provides. You're getting that methodology and the practice that'll prepare you for your future.
Good evening. I'm Eve Stern, Director of URI's Center for the Humanities, and I'd like to welcome you to the first event in this semester's series, Re-envisioning Nature, an Environmental Humanities Lecture Series. This year-long series of virtual and in-person events explores the ways in which the humanities can help us to interpret and engage with the pressing environmental questions of our day. This evening, the Center is delighted to welcome Gavin Van Horn of the Center for Humans and Nature, who will be speaking about paths to wildness. We'll have questions and answers after the panel, so please type your questions into the chat at any time and like and share us on social media. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Eric Loomis, Professor of History at URI and a sought-after expert on labor and environmental history, to introduce our speaker.
Hello, and thank you all for joining us on this fine evening. I am very happy to be introducing Gavin Van Horn tonight. We here live in Rhode Island, and a lot of times I think that we don't really think of ourselves, outside of the beach and the bay. But a lot of times, given our our dense urban environment in Providence and Warwick and Cranston and Pawtucket, Central Falls, that we don't really see ourselves as that close to nature sometimes. And then we sometimes even laugh today. Henry David Thoreau, the great environmental writer, sometimes people chuckle because they find out that when Thoreau went and lived at Walden Pond, he was within walking distance of his hometown and could go visit people and all of this. And they think, well, that's not really a true wilderness experience. But then isn't that the point, that in fact nature is all around us and there's all kinds of wildness that is next to us that maybe we're just not really trained to see? And I thought, this is something that would be really important as we deal with a world of climate change, a world of disaster, but a world of also tremendous beauty. And I thought that one way to sort of address these questions and maybe to get the Rhode Island community to think about this in a slightly different way would be to have one of the nation's true experts on these kinds of issues speak to us, and that is Dr. Gavin Van Horn. Gavin is a tremendous writer and editor. He wrote a book called The Way of Coyote, Shared Journeys in the Urban Wilds. He, with the Center for Humans and Nature, where he works, he edited or co-edited a 5-volume series called Kinship, Belonging in a World of Relations. He edited or co-edited, I should say, another great book, Wildness, Relations of People and Place. And these are some of the things, as well as City Creatures, I should say, one more. City Creatures, Animal Encounters in the Chicago Wilderness. And there's plenty of animal encounters in the Providence Wilderness, too, if we just know where to look. And so based on that, I really wanted to have Gavin Van Horn of the Center for Humans and Nature speak to us tonight. And so, Gavin, I welcome you to the University of Rhode Island, and I thank you for speaking to us. And I also want to say, please, again, place questions in the chat where you hope to have a really nice conversation after this. So, Gavin, I'll leave it to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for having me here. I'm so pleased to be here for the University of Rhode Island, and especially because this event focuses on the environmental humanities, which is near and dear to my heart. So that's the field that I come out of. I have a PhD in religious studies, and so because of that, I oftentimes think in terms of the big stories that people tell about the world and the stories that we inherit, and the ways that those stories then affect how we engage with our ecological landscapes. The ways that the stories in our minds don't stay in our minds, but they are enacted on the ground. So we're going to be talking about some of those big stories tonight for you on the East Coast, today for me here on the West Coast. And we're going to start with a bit of interactive component to this. I'm going to ask you to use your imagination. And because you aren't on the screen, feel free to close your eyes if it helps. And I want you to picture in your mind a rugged slate-colored mountain. You can distinctly see where the tree line ends, where the conifers give up their climb, surrendering to the rock. You can see the snowy summit, sheathed in wisps of torn cloud. Now ask yourself, is this wildness? Switching landscapes, I want you to picture in your mind's eye now a lush green valley. A sliver of stream meanders lazily through its bottom. A clump of cotton ball-shaped sheep browse on the valley floor, picking their way along the riverside. Now ask yourself, is this wildness? Another landscape. I want you to picture an alleyway between buildings, paint peels from metal doors and rusted gutters. A crack like a lightning bolt runs across a chunk of pavement. Out of that crack, a single butter yellow flower blooms in a patch of sunlight. Green mosses climb the brick. Now ask yourself, is this wildness? And the last one, I want you to hold your hand in front of your eyes and take a deep breath. Look at your hand and ask yourself, is this wildness? Today we're going to be talking about wildness, not wilderness, and we'll set some of that up by talking about wilderness first, but we'll be talking about what wildness is, why wildness matters, and then combining the what and the why, how wildness creates a relation with the landscape. We become relational beings. We enact our wildness in a mutual reciprocity. So I've asked you to consider some images in your mind's eye and to see how they might fit or not with what you currently associate with wildness. But let's get a little bit further into it and begin by way of contrast by talking about a more familiar term, which is wilderness. What thoughts does wilderness conjure for you? Perhaps it's the sweeping romantic landscapes of painters within the Hudson River School, like Thomas Cole, this painting in 1836, the Oxbow, the forbidding, craggy, threatening, looming forces of nature on one side and the cultivated, peaceful, bucolic images on the other side of the painting. Or perhaps it's Albert Bierstadt's monumental peaks, drenched in divine light, and a herd of deer roaming next to a mere like lake surface. Perhaps that's wilderness. Or maybe you think of something you see in a Sierra Club calendar, an Ansel Adams photograph that might be hung on a dorm room wall, like this Silvertone picture on the screen. Wilderness is something conventionally associated with humbling, titanic landscapes. Perhaps those colossal, seemingly primeval places evoke feelings of the sublime, of humans humbled before nature's massive forces. But speaking of humans, you'll notice that in each of the images that I showed there, that we're out of the frame. We're subjects gazing upon objects. And I'll circle back to that soon because it's very important. But wilderness, simply put, is a politically designated area that has been zoned for a certain type of land use. So here you have a map of the state of Washington with all the wilderness areas listed. And one common definition for wilderness is untrammeled lands where humans are visitors who do not remain. That's what the Wilderness Act tells us. The boundaries on the map will tell you where the wilderness is. And if you go outside those designated boundaries, the land becomes something else. Perhaps private lands, multiple use lands, mining claims, or even the exurbs of Seattle. It's no doubt a good thing to keep particular types of human activities out of certain areas, especially large-scale, intensive, extractive activities that undermine the ecological well-being of a landscape. However, it's safe to say that this idea of wilderness has reinforced a kind of environmental narrative or a kind of environmental discourse in the United States. And that narrative has been exported to other parts of the world. We don't have time tonight to fully dwell on that here, but I'm going to give you just one sort of mnemonic example, if you will, an image to carry with you. So here's a sign: please protect natural resources by staying on the trail. And it's maybe common to see out and about, but I'd like to consider for a moment the subtext of this very common signage. On the one hand, the sign encourages what's most people would consider a good thing, that we need to take care by watching where we step. It calls its readers into an awareness that there are other types of animals and plants in that place whose survival might depend on minimal disturbance. It encourages us to give them some room. On the other hand, and here's the subtext, so common that it might escape our notice on first glance, humans are implicitly characterized in a sign like this as separate from other forms of life. And other forms of life are natural resources. So we're told that we best protect living things, resources for us, by absenting ourselves, by separating our worlds. In effect, humans and nature are different. We are the subjects and other things are the objects, the natural resources for our well-being. This is nature as an object, valued for its ecological, economic, or spiritual utility, or some combination of those. And that captures one of the essences of the wilderness idea, that nature in its purest form is a place in which humans are visitors who don't remain. But what about wildness? So here's a simple way of putting it. If wilderness is a place, wildness is a process. Wilderness is a bounded area. Wildness is unbounded energy, the flow of nutrients, oxygen, matter, energy, elemental forces of earth, air, water, fire. Wildness is a self-generating and regenerating aspects of what makes this planet a freaking place of aliveness. That, to quote Charles Darwin, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Wildness is the wolf's tooth that chisels the antelope's speed in the evolutionary dance of predator and prey, to paraphrase Robinson Jeffers, the poet. It's a seed bank ready to rise from the pavement cracks and the green fuse that dries the flower, to quote Dylan Thomas. And guess what? It flows through you and me and all of us as well. We are wild all the way down, from our big-brained heads to our bipedal feet and everything in between, dependent on our next breath from the trees, reliant on millennia-old partnerships of bacteria in our guts for digestion. I've got a little bit of wild news for you. You're not even an individual. You are a wild ecosystem. So Scott F. Gilbert and company write that if the early modern period gave rise to the notion of an independent citizen, which in turn led to a scientific paradigm of the autonomous individual agent, that we must now admit that a critical unit of anatomy is what he calls, and what others have called, the holobiont. And that's there at the bottom of the screen, the multicellular eukaryote plus its colonies of persistent symbionts. It's scientific language for saying that we are a muddle of different types of life. The human body consists of many different things. And to quote him here, he says, estimates that 90% of the cells that comprise our bodies are bacterial belie in any simple anatomical understanding of individual identity. Metagenomic sequencing has shown that each human gut has entered into a persistent partnership with over 150 species of bacteria, and that the human species maintains about 1,000 major bacteria groups in our gut microbiome. There's a lot more mind-blowing stuff to say about this, which is why I provided the reference there on the screen so you can look it up for yourself. But he and his collaborators conclude, quote, for animals as well as plants, there have never been individuals. This new paradigm for biology asks new questions and seeks new relationships among the different living entities of Earth. We are all lichens. That being the symbiotic merger of algae and fungus. Lichen. I don't mean to confuse it with like lycanthropy or something like that. So in short, we humans are hybrid. We're wild beings and we couldn't exist unless we were. In a very real and practical sense, we are our relations from the micro to the macro. So let's scale back up for a moment. John Hausdorfer and I co-edited a book that Eric mentioned at the beginning of this talk not too long ago that took the title Wildness. And the subtitle, Relations of People in Place, identifies why we wanted to call attention to wildness. So if wildness is about humans, or if wilderness is about humans apart from place or out of the frame of the picture, at least visibly, because of course our impacts are felt whether we are bodily in a wilderness area or not in terms of air and soil chemistry, drought and fire. But if wilderness is about humans apart from place, then wildness asks, how can humans be a part of the processes that make places healthy, robust, and ecologically diverse? How can we better fit within our landscapes, which are always and already embedded within us? So some other connotations or words that might help with the idea of wildness are things like flow, fecundity, ferality, or to borrow from scholar Donna Haraway, who takes her inspiration from biologist Lynn Margulis, sympoiesis, which is a word that means making with. Things are made with, they're made alongside one another in relationship with one another. Aldo Leopold calls it the capacity for the land for self-renewal. So it's a circulating energy, a life force, a green fire, again, to use Aldo's words. And wildness comes at different scales. As to this idea of making with, an ethnobotanist friend of mine, Enrique Salmon, contributed an essay to the book Wildness about the Rarámuri people of central Mexico who have no word for wilderness or wildness in their lexicon. And Enrique recently sent John, the co-editor, and I an email, and he said, I thought you'd like this. I'm reviewing a book for the Western Historical Society called Gardening at the Margins. I came across a line that I thought you guys would find interesting. And he says, quote, before Europeans created wilderness, indigenous peoples farmed wildness. That tells you something about that relationship, that wildness can be cultivated, that wildness can be something that increases as we become co-creators with it. And so like what he said about farming wildness, it's something that can grow with participation. And Enrique, indeed, he refers to his people, the Rarámuri, as keystone species in their landscape that is full of kin, what he calls a kin-centric ecology. They tend their places and produce more biodiversity, not less, more opportunities for co-creating wildness. So we put together this book because we wanted to emphasize that wildness is about connection and deepening that connection where we are. We knew that there are plenty of examples of human interactions where the land becomes a part of the culture or community. The community becomes defined by their land relationships. It becomes kin, an extended family. And those voices, those types of stories are ones that are more infrequently told than the sort of disaster scenarios that we're familiar with. The fact is, the majority of the news that we ingest is, it's sometimes referred to as what's called negative news bias, right? If it bleeds, it leads, is the catchphrase used to capture the rush to raise our heart rates and to create clickbait. So for me, this book was a way to gather other kinds of stories, to show that there are ways to live with and respond to the agency of other beings and the landscape itself, no matter where one is. In short, Wildness asks us to see the world not as passive scenery. Rather, we are immersed and enmeshed in a wild continuum. And perhaps particularly relevant for today, Wildness can help us think about how cities can be better integrated into the landscapes of which they are a part, for how we might welcome, even celebrate, the presence of non-human beings in our midst and our shared relationship with them. So Dr. Loomis told me that many of his students, maybe quite a few on this call today, had minimal experience with the huge sweeping Western landscapes, and that's fine. I'm here to say I hope you eventually do get to visit places like Yellowstone and Glacier National Park and Denali. I do. But it's what is close at hand that will be most formative, I think, for your perception and everyday ethics, your care and your concern. That's Wildness. That's the generative forces that flow through all landscapes, even the most urbanized. So I'll spend most of our time today talking about Wildness close to home, the backyard, as opposed to the bioregion. Well, one of the 4 sections in the book Wildness is dedicated to urban areas, including 3 essays that are set in Chicago, which is where I used to live. The chapter that I wrote for the book is about an organization called Green Corps Chicago, where 90% of the participants in that program were formerly incarcerated. And this is a program to teach landscape management, job skills, and ecological restoration in particular. So these Green Corps crews go out throughout the city of Chicago and work in the Chicago forest preserves, doing things like controlled burns, like weeding invasive species so that sunlight can reach the forest floor and the seed bank that is there. And some profound changes happen as people are in that program. And to me, it well represented that sense of wildness as a kind of mutual healing, a mutual reciprocity. And I'm going to read you just the short excerpt from that chapter that gets at some of that idea. So this is me talking to Henry Jordan, who was an advanced crew supervisor for Green Corps Chicago. Henry Jordan has been working for Green Corps for more than 4 years, and it's easy to discern why he is a supervisor. In a word, he has presence. The kind of presence that is communicated by the way he weighs my questions, sifts through them, then measures out his words from experience. Among his crew, he's known as the chainsaw guy, the one who knows trees by their Latin binomials and can discern the healthy ones from the unhealthy. He has 4 apps on his phone for tree identification, tries to learn a new tree every day, and reads continuously. As he puts it, everywhere I go, if it's green, I'm observing it. Another thing about Henry, he's an ex-felon. He's lived his entire life in Chicago. By his own account, he grew up in the ghetto and was exposed to the vicious cycle of the streets. Like many who have been through the Green Corps program, for Henry, the job wasn't just a job. Green Corps was a catalyst to a better life. And this is Henry, quote, "Everything in your life is a process of becoming. The question is whether you become. And as humans, we have a large say in what we become." Henry wipes a hand over his brow and removes his white hard hat, the kind you might see on a construction crew's chief's head. As he does so, it occurs to me that a new kind of construction is occurring here in Eggers Woods and throughout the city's forest preserve, a construction of relationships between people and land, an opportunity for the emergence of wildness. There are nuts and bolts aspects to working with Green Corps, skill building and showing up on time and doing good work. But there's also something deeper that Henry articulates. Quote, "You're interacting with something that has life in it. Even if it's not another human, it has life in it, which touches something on the inside that doesn't often get touched." As Henry and I discuss the kind of Chicago he wants his daughter to grow up in, he talks about the need to involve more people in caring for their local environments. When that happens, urban nature isn't an abstraction. As he says, now it's part of you. One of the reasons that ecological restoration is so important within urban areas is that it provides a hands-on and close-to-home appreciation for the wild beings with whom we coexist. This can lead to an understanding of urban areas as life worlds full of other than human ways of being, as places that we are responsible for shaping with the needs of other species in mind. Perhaps wildness in this sense is not something discovered so much as something that emerges from relationships that, as Henry says, become part of you. That kind of understanding that we can learn to weave our lives gracefully into the larger community of life is what wildness is all about, to increase the capacity of the land for self-renewal. Our relationship is not merely economic with the land or ecological, it's social. And it's possible to become part of this extended ecological family. So let's focus on wildness as a way to do this, to honor our social relationships with the wild world. I'm guessing that most of you probably spend most of your time living, working, and playing in urban areas. And I want to attempt today to disrupt or maybe just help shift your perception of what defines a city. Much of this is based on my own experience of having my own ideas about the city disrupted when I moved to Chicago in 2010. That wasn't my plan A. I knew, of course, that cities were full of humans with diverse stories, languages, and cultures. But what I came to understand was that there are also places of non-human movements, languages, and ways of being. And those creatures carry their own stories of migration and dwelling. Whatever else a city might be, I'd like you to remember this from our time together. The city is habitat. It's alive. And our animal kin can help us rethink what our responsibilities to nature are by reframing our ideas about where nature is or where nature can be. So the book I wrote, The Way of Coyote, is about my own orientation to urban life. And it carries Coyote's name because in the United States, coyotes have come to the city and they've done a nice job of muddying the boundaries between what we sometimes think of as the separation between urban areas and the natural world. They disrupt, in other words, that narrative discourse, the 20th century idea of the bifurcation between humans and nature. This is an image of a coyote that I took one day, and this is what's known as the mutual gaze. When another animal regards you, acknowledges your presence, and shows that we're being watched. And I kind of carried that around with me a lot, the idea that we as humans are being watched by other animals, by our kinfolk in the city. And now that I'm in California, you know, kind of their geographical and historical stomping grounds, I check in with them as well here. But coyotes in Chicago, there's like 4,000 probably coyotes in Chicago, and now they've spread to every urban area in the United States. So a good deal of my work at the Center for Humans and Nature focuses on how we can become, how we can respond and become responsible for the well-being of our places. Coyotes are only a starting point. They're a portal into a much larger question about how many other animals navigate the city with us and how we might adapt to intentionally include them and their other than human kin within our urban areas. So we're living at a time when a lot of the pressures that once drove animals away from the city are relaxing. Many cities are becoming post-industrial, and the search is on to attract people with natural amenities like parks and green spaces, healthy lifestyle options, and other ways to connect to the city as a whole. And those things are good for the adaptive animals who are finding their ways among us. In fact, I would say that their health is linked to ours. There are so many people who are actively working to heal natural areas within the city to encourage coexistence. I've already mentioned Green Corps Chicago as one example, and I'll get to another example in just a moment. But these are people who have come to the realization that the city is full of natural wonders. That's not to say that cities are perfectly fine as they are, and certainly the fixes aren't easy, but I would suggest that other animals can help us to listen again so that we can rethink and restory our urban areas. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of what I'm getting at. First up, I want to take you to downtown Chicago, specifically to the office building where I used to work. This is an image of the Civic Opera House. It's architecturally an intriguing piece of work, 1920s Art Deco, located on the banks, if there were still banks, of the Chicago River. But I don't want to dwell on the style of building. I want to talk rather about the wild ways that other animals adapt to buildings like this. And to do that, I'd like to mention a colleague of mine who frequently in the middle of a workday would begin pointing out the window and saying, "Ooh, ooh, ooh." So what was my workmate pointing at? Falco peregrinus, commonly known as the peregrine falcon. A couple of stats about peregrines. So they're aerial hunters striking other birds from above in what is called a stoop. And in these dive bombing free falls, they've been clocked at speeds of over 200 miles per hour, the fastest speed, in fact, of any animal on the planet. And so why are they in downtown Chicago, circling above Millennium Park and Wacker Drive, causing me and my office mates to run to the window to see them spiraling above or picking apart a pigeon on a ledge? Habitat. Other things too, but let's start with the habitat. So on the one hand, and this is a person checking, a scientist checking a peregrine nest, and you can see she's got the helmet on top of her head so she can absorb the shocks of peregrine fists. So on the one hand, skyscrapers in downtown Chicago, with the grid of roads between them, are largely an imposition on the natural landscape. But these buildings and roads also inadvertently create something that peregrines recognize: canyonlands, steep-walled, elevated places to build nest and hunt an abundance of prey. As a keen-eyed, aerodynamic, aerial carnivore, thank you very much, says the peregrine. So let's call this repurposing of urban habitat a passive form of kinship on our part. And while you're thinking about that, another component of this story that is of some interest to us, it's a social component, because peregrines were once threatened by the chemical use of DDT, which thinned their eggshells where they couldn't hold a baby bird to term. So they were rapidly going extinct. So scientists began to breed and release them, and DDT was banned. And that combination of things has created a restoration of peregrines. And now they're in many urban areas, including Chicago, which is where I work. I used to live in Evanston, Illinois, which is just north of Chicago. And there's a peregrine pair there named Nona and Squawker, who make a nest at the public library every year. And that's a little closer to ground level, so it's easy enough to just take the 3 flights of stairs up and look out the window, and you can see them in their annual egg fussings over their peregrine chicks. It's a good reminder to me that urban ecology isn't an abstract concept. It means that wild beings are in our midst, making use of what we've built: hunting, raising families, playing, communicating, living, and many of them thriving, enlivening our cities. So sometimes accidentally or passively, we create things that other animals benefit from. But what if we want to increase our engagement? What if we want to move from a passive form of habitat, repurposing by other animals, to a more active role of kinship? How can we increase our engagement and our attention and our care? So that would, a good creaturely mnemonic for this might be, in the United States at least, the monarch butterfly. So monarchs have become poster creatures for pollinator habitat because of their incredible migratory journeys that sometimes cover thousands of miles. At present, there's an incredible team of folks led by Abigail Derby Lewis at Chicago's Field Museum who are looking at how to create more potential habitat for monarchs, and especially how urban areas can be critical in that creation of habitat. Because in Illinois, much of the rural parts of Illinois are farmland, largely soy and corn monocultures, and often heavily drenched in pesticides. They're not good places for insect survival, including monarchs. So Abigail and her team have turned to focus on both large and mid-sized cities in the Midwest as potential refuges and way stations for monarchs on their journeys. But the cool thing about monarchs is, although they're this charismatic butterfly that most people recognize, if you protect the monarchs and the monarch habitat in particular, you're also increasing the likelihood of survival by other pollinators, bees and butterflies, other insects, making for more diverse urban areas. And right now, that team, in addition to putting out literature, are meeting with government officials to talk about backyards, schoolyards, vacant lots, cemeteries, golf courses, residential areas, other places that are prime for this kind of habitat restoration. That's a shift of mind I want to encourage if you think of cities as less than. And I remember when this clicked for me, when all the non-paved areas around me in the city stopped looking like weedy or undeveloped lands and became exciting prospects and for potential life-giving and generating habitat. It was when I took a walk with a woman named Lisa Hish through her neighborhood that I saw that this really came clear for me. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Lisa and the Parkway Corner Initiative. So Lisa and her partner, originally they just wanted to house honeybees in their backyard. So they bought a beehive, and then they started to map out the area that they lived in, their neighborhood, to find out where the bees would forage for nectar and pollen and so forth. And by doing that and asking their neighbors about it, they got their neighbors interested in what they were doing. Then they realized they had these corners, like at four-way stops, where there were just weedy plants or sometimes just cracked pavement, sometimes just pebbles and rubble that could be habitat. So they started this adopt a corner program where 3 or 4 families would adopt an individual street corner and plant native plants, put up bee friendly pollinating habitat, sometimes bat boxes, little artistic projects. So it was a beautification, but it was also beautification with the main purpose of creating places where these other animals would thrive. And from that small beginning, then they started to spread through the neighborhood. They started to talk about corridors through the neighborhood, what they called the Parkway Corner, from the Parkway Corner Initiative to a pollinator pathway, all the way from the Chicago River to Lake Michigan. So as we walked together and I scanned the neighborhood and the scrawl of the cars and the roads faded, every lawn, every road median, shoulder, every balcony and flower bed and roof and forgotten patch of grass between the buildings emerged from the background as an opportunity for life. And Lisa told me, quote, "Now I see cities as habitat, a place to keep us living efficiently as a species, but also places where we will need to be in relationship with other species for our health, our understanding of our place in the world." I looked around at those nondescript medians and street corners, and I suddenly saw what wildness was possible. I consider this a version of Aldo Leopold's call to think like a mountain, but instead it would be think like a bee. With all the overwhelming problems facing us in the 21st century, this is one of the places that I find hope and meaning. So trying to tackle complicated global problems is daunting, and it can be psychologically paralyzing. But what about your backyard? What about your balcony? Your neighborhood street corners? Think small and you end up thinking big. Care for the small wonders and you end up caring what a city looks like and how it fits within the bioregion. Think about milkweed and monarch butterflies, and you'll end up thinking about a 2000 migration from central Mexico through the Midwest and up the East Coast to where you are, covered by multiple generations of a winged insect that weighs as much of a dusting of sugar in your morning coffee. I've called these types of actions, like the pollinator pathway that Lisa and her neighbors participate in, micro rewildings. They aren't national parks. They aren't those paintings you saw at the beginning. They aren't big legislative action to protect open space. They're intimate, within walking distance, just backyard acts of care for other than human kin that braids our lives together. Thinking like a bee allows us to see a city with new eyes, to open our minds and ears and to discover the wild world that is waiting. Sharon Blackie, a mythologist and psychologist, gets at this when she writes in her book, The Enchanted Life, human mythologies and cosmologies have always emerged from the landscape. They don't just come out of our heads. They're a product of our immersion in the world, of our interaction with our places. In a sense, they're acts of co-creation between humans and the land. To have a thriving multi-species community requires that we take on the perspective of our creaturely kin. So think like a peregrine, think like a monarch, think like a bee. So to recap this portion, there is passive awareness where we become aware or cognizant that other creatures use what we've built to their own ends, sometimes in stunningly creative ways, such as peregrine falcons. We haven't necessarily intended to benefit them, but we sometimes do. And becoming aware of that can open our eyes or create that ooh sense of wonder when we realize it. So that's passive awareness. And then there's active kinship. And this represents knowing other species' needs and deliberately and intentionally creating and caring for places with wildlife in mind. That's the joyful task of integrating our lives and our livelihoods into the more than human community. Another way of saying it is a co-creation of wildness. So once we begin to understand that our life stories are entangled with the life stories of other creatures and that they're breathing co-creations, we might ask ourselves, where do we begin? Well, the simple answer is we begin where we are. We take a single step and then another. What's within reach? Art, journaling, photography, gardening, walking, kayaking, natural history study, restoration ecology, creating pollinator pathways. There are many ways to interweave our stories into the places we share. And this brings me to my final reflection for you today. We've had a bit of a bird's eye view, sometimes literally, when it comes to wildness. But I'd like to leave you with something that's a bit more practical in nature, something simpler and near at hand that you might do to welcome and invite wild perceptions into your day-to-day. Other than some of the examples I've already discussed, like habitat restoration or neighborhood gardening, what might it mean to practice wildness? The core of an answer to that question, I think, is how we become more receptive to our living kinship to the world. And there are tons of ways to practice that receptivity, depending on the person. You'll find some things that work for you and some things that are less effective, I think. I recall a mini exercise I used to do with my environmental studies students where I would take them out to the edge of campus and they would each have a string that was about a foot in diameter, just set it on a patch of ground and just watch to see what would happen. And it's funny, you know, when you slow down like that, and when you take the time and allow yourself to be present for something like that, you begin to notice things that you never would have noticed before. An ant crawling up a blade of grass, a tiny mushroom cap in a patch of soil, or an intricate shape of a flower bloom. Microcosms are all around us, and the longer you watch, the more reveals itself. And there are many ways of practicing that kind of presence. Birders would advise you to spend extended periods of time in what they call a sit spot, sitting in the same place, opening your ears. Or it could be that you choose a particular tree or rock and spend several seasons with that particular tree or rock. And maybe it's as simple as closing your eyes and not relying on your sense of sight, but all of your other senses. Everything I just mentioned has one thing in common. It's a practice of presence, full-bodied listening exercise that reminds us that whatever the world may be, it is an animate, multi-part, multi-creature conversation. As for listening with one's body, I'll offer a practice today that's been important to me, with the hopes that maybe it'll be a good thing for you to experiment with as well. I'd like to share with you what I call a slow walk. So I've walked many miles through the city, threading my ways through urban cemeteries, and lakeshore edges, back alleyways, parks, golf courses, urban forest trails. It's been a huge part of changing my view of what a city is and what a city can be. So what might characterize a slow walk? Well, here's a couple of things. So as I said before, maybe most important, open your senses, but maybe try to intentionally refrain from naming things as you walk. Just experience them. If thoughts arise, you can set them aside. Another really important thing, walk at maybe half your normal speed, if not slower. And that'll take some getting used to, but remind yourself that you're not trying to get anywhere in particular. The only goal is to be present, to notice what you notice, what draws your attention. Follow that instinct and linger. It's helpful to remember that this type of walking is not a monologue, it's a conversation. So you're opening your body to listen to the world around you. And when we allow others to present themselves to us, to stop to try to control them or impose our own will, that opens up a space to receive. So we allow our footfall to fall into the rhythm with Earth's rhythms, not worrying about getting from point A to point B in the minimum time, but we may find point C or point Q or point M more interesting. And that's, Thoreau was invoked before. He talks about sauntering. He has an essay called Walking. It's a beautiful essay. This is traipsing. This is wild walking, open enough to be led to where you did not expect to go. So that type of walking invites a shift in one's perceptions, from looking at the world as passive scenery to experiencing it as a living, breathing, wild life world. And as an example of this, I'm going to read you just a very short excerpt from The Way of Coyote, where I walk in a place called the Calsag Channel. It used to be a terribly polluted industrial corridor in Southeast Chicago that has now been repurposed as a trail for biking and walking. And here's just a few thoughts about that trail. A trail like the Calsag forms part of a larger corridor, a threaded dyad of blue and green that passes like a stitch through the city's fabric. The defined edges of the Calsag, the waterway on one side, a roadway with trees muffling the sounds of distant automobiles on the other, forms a curving passageway through the built environment, a corridor of and for life. Conservation biologists sometimes speak of the factors that contribute to a landscape's ecological viability as the 3 Cs: large carnivores, cores, and corridors. Large carnivores because of top-down predation and prey regulation, which buffers vegetation from the voracious appetites of herbivores. Cores because large contiguous blocks of habitat tend to support more species, some of whom need large amounts of unfragmented land to survive. Corridors because they are the arteries that keep the land's lifeblood flowing. Corridors provide safe passage around, under, or over paved roads. Corridors offer escape routes and lifelines between populations of species that would otherwise be genetically isolated. Near the end of an essay by Gary Snyder, he writes, "The best purpose of wilderness studies and hikes is to be able to come back to the lowlands and see all the land around us, agricultural, suburban, urban, as part of the same territory, never totally ruined, never completely unnatural. It can be restored, and humans could live in considerable numbers on much of it. Great brown bear is walking with us, salmon swimming upstream with us, as we stroll a city street. Or in Chicago's case, coyote is already walking with us. Catfish is already swimming up the channel with us as we stroll a city street. Cities need not be defined solely by their tangle of pavement or buildings. That's only one story. As I walk, I link paths by linking lives, human and non-human. The memories will be waiting when I come back. My feet will add further stitches to the fabric of the city, weaving me into this place, weaving this place into me. The Chicago I've come to know on foot is an entanglement of life. An osprey pair living on the Calsag Channel might deliver the same message. Protecting walking paths, creating new ones, upholding the rite of passage that corridors provide, all mark a contribution to the collective reweaving of the city. The greatest incentive for caring about such corridors is likely getting to know them with one's feet. The city has plenty of places to ramble and plenty of places that need ramblers, places to start and continue interspecies conversations, places to experience firsthand that nature is in and of the city. Given a slower pace as well as renewed attention, memories, and associations, stories can emerge alongside new corridors. Maybe they've always arisen together that way. So, a trail is different each time you walk it, not just because of the different emotions or openness you bring to it on any given day, but based on how you walk it. So, one more little step for you, so to speak, in this wild walking practice. If you can, and it's safe to do so, I'd recommend removing your shoes. Being barefoot forces you, oftentimes pleasantly, to slow down and thus better absorb the textures of place. Your skin to the earth's, skin to kin, feeling out the details of touch, heels overhead. I found barefoot walking to be an excellent way of listening from the ground up. The gifts I know I'm able to give to this world are meager when considering what the world gifts to me. Yet I think that a good starting point is the gift of attention. Slow, attentive walking helps me to do that, helps me to practice listening with all my senses, and reminds me that my engagement with Earth's wildness is an ongoing conversation. So when we care for our creaturely kin, we weave our own stories into the tracks, traces, trails, underground burrows, flyways, and wakes of other creatures. Our stories become intertwined. Fresh stories are created. If you give slow walking a try, I would add that you might want to pause completely every so often to give a moment just a little bit of extra attention and see what happens. I found the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh's walking advice helpful in this respect. He advises pausing every few minutes and saying out loud, "I have arrived. I am home." That to me is what cultivating wildness is all about. Reaffirming, remembering, responding by practicing the mantra, "I have arrived. I am home." And that, my fellow wildlings, is, I think, a good place to end this talk and open up things for a larger conversation.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Gavin. That was wonderful. I'm going to ask a question or two, and we have one or two questions that are presently in the chat, but I would really encourage listeners to put a question in so that we can expand this conversation. So it's not just between the two of us, but rather between you and Gavin. And, I think that as a place to sort of start here, to kind of think a little bit more about Thoreau, in the mid 19th century, Thoreau is responding to an America that is engaging in very rapid change, and for those who would be concerned about an environment, which not very many people really were at that time, very concerned, right, and worrisome about what's going to be left, and you are in a sense doing some of the same thing, right? That we exist in a world in which change is, very rapid and pretty scary, given the realities of climate. And, you are sort of, in a sense, like Thoreau, trying to get us to sort of think in a different way. And I guess one thing that I'm wondering is, what is it about our culture? Because as you pointed out, with your colleague, who is the indigenous person from Mexico, not all societies struggle to understand a sense of wildness, right? Not all cultures place such barriers between themselves and the natural world, artificial as they may be. And so what is it about, whether it's the US or Western culture, however you want to define it, that we so constantly need these reminders that we are actually part of a natural, that we are wild, and that we can have a different interaction with the natural world than one that we are so frequently having?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it gets at the root of the problem, really, I think, which, I mentioned at the beginning that I'm all about, what are the sort of bigger stories that we're telling ourselves, and that create these kinds of attitudes, toward the natural world. So I think that gets at the heart of it. And I think you can point to a lot of different things. There's a lot of different streams that have mixed together in Western culture that would have us, as I said in the talk, view the world as a collection of objects, view the nature as a warehouse for our, simply for human well-being. Some people call this human exceptionalism, where we think we're atop of a creaturely pyramid, we're a superior being, somehow that we've, and other creatures exist to serve our interests or our needs. We don't exist in lateral relationship to them. But I think that the really important point about this is something that I sometimes have referred to as a sense of orphanhood, that we've have a broken relationship with land because we've thought of land as simply an inanimate object, as dead matter. And in doing so, it creates a kind of existential estrangement, really, from the land itself. And I think that's because of stories that we've inherited that teach us how to view the land, whether they're religious stories from more kind of out of the Enlightenment, or stories that go all the way back to some of the beginnings of when agriculture and settled societies began to stratify and create power hierarchies that then affected the way that we engaged with a land that was out there and domesticated versus wild lands. And so I think a big task or a big role is to find those, for each of us really, is to find those stories that remind us of the animacy of the land, that remind us of the relationship that we have, and that we are completely dependent on, that we are not independent beings somehow floating above it all, but we are completely dependent on our relations with the land. For me, I'll tell you a personal story that kind of encapsulates this for me, Eric. So when I was in 4th grade, I grew up in Oklahoma. And if you know a little bit of history about Oklahoma, then you know that was a place that was viewed as kind of a no man's land, that was not viewed as a valuable. And so Native American peoples from around the country, but particularly in the Southeast, were moved forcibly to Oklahoma. And so there's many tribes, upward of more than a dozen tribes that were in that area. In the middle of that land were what were called the unassigned lands, that in 1889, in the last gasp of kind of manifest destiny, a gun was literally fired and people lined up on the starting line and ran in to claim that land. Well, in 4th grade, we reenacted that on our playground as not as a bad thing, as a celebration of land acquisition and pioneer spirit. And, I had my checkered scarf on and my cowboy hat, and I ran out there and lined off, staked out some ground to keep other people out of my ground. And, and it was just this incredible, looking back as an adult, an incredible reenactment of a colonizing worldview, right? So that's really what we've got going on here, is we're still in the throes of a kind of colonizing extractivist worldview. And then there are, though, all these other alternatives to that I think need to be lifted up and heard.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gavin. We do have a few questions from the audience. There it is from Yasmin here. Why does wilderness and wildness seem to have different definitions if both use the term wild?
Good question, Yasmin. So they do have a similar etymology. What you're saying is they each include the word wild, which probably comes from wildeor, which is the place of wild deer. This is tracing back, and both of them have that idea of a kind of self-willed, a kind of a kind of wildly generative self-will, right? But wilderness is a noun meaning a place, and I want to draw that distinction, a really hard distinction, because wildness is, as I said, if wilderness is a place, then wildness is a process. So the wildness can flow through these huge wilderness areas, like a Denali, like a Yellowstone, but it can also flow through the urban concrete, through the, like I said, like the dandelion pushing up through the crack in the concrete. These are just the generative forces of life. So you have these large scale examples in what we call wilderness, but wildness is actually the flow through those things. And where wilderness has become a kind of problematic word and term in some cases is historically, as Eric probably well knows, wilderness is sometimes an area where people were already inhabiting that area. They were already living there. That was homeland to them. And sometimes they were intentionally moved out of those homelands to create wilderness. So I like to focus on wildness because that is that extremely important process that we are all bound up with and within, whereas wilderness is an area that is zoned, a form of land use.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. I think next we are going to take a question from Jimena Sevilla, who is, I should say, a outstanding environmental historian of her own here at the University of Rhode Island, who works on Latin America. And she asked, to what extent do you think that the growing awareness to the non-human world, not just pets, outdoor activities, spiritual and ecological beliefs, can counter the Anthropocene era that we live in?
Well, I think it's, I mean, as you probably can guess, I think it's critical even in questioning that very term, the Anthropocene, which others have done, and for very good reason, I think. It's a little high and mighty of us to, we want to acknowledge that there's been drastic and rapid change, but to call it the Anthropocene might be to sort of reinstate the problem I was talking about before with this idea that humans are somehow, qualitatively apart from other creatures. So one way to, I think, I don't know if you use the word counteract that, but one of the words that I used in my talk was the idea of portal. And I think that one of the reasons that when I moved to Chicago, that I focused on urban animals, non-human animals, was because they seem to be the most present and accessible in some ways to people. So it's one of those things that it might be harder for somebody to conceptualize, ecological processes and flows, but they recognize when a coyote walks across the street and go, why the hell is that there? And that opens up a whole conversation about how, this is a shared environment. I mean, this is, and can kind of unfold into many other topics and discussions. I think for each of these, each animal, each plant, each fungus, each, all these different creatures can be a portal into those larger network of relationships that can serve to destabilize that notion of anthropocentrism. That is the idea that humans are the center of of our worlds, of everyone's worlds, rather than, it's kind of like we are the sun we revolve around. So destabilizing that, showing that no, we're full of multiple intelligences, multiple ways of being and communicating and living and thriving, I think can lead to that the ethic of care for place.
Okay. Thank you. Next question from the comments. From Emily Diamond, who's another one of our excellent URI environmental policy scholars here. The conception of wildness seems antithetical to the capitalist society that we have found ourselves in, especially in cities. How do you see wildness fitting in with urban capitalism? And I'll just add to that, Gavin, by saying that that at least for me, I mean, as also a labor person, that capitalism really is in many ways, I would argue, a big part of the problems that we have. That, in other words, that the capitalism itself is so actively encouraging us to not spend that kind of slow walk with nature. That slow walking in nature and noticing what's around you is not what makes profit. And so, just to add just a little bit to Emily's question, but please, I'm really curious what you have to say.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it reminds me of, one of the things that I sort of take a glancing look at in one of the essays I wrote for the book was how in Chicago, in certain areas of Chicago, before the advent of the iPhone, there were clocks everywhere on all the street corners. And it's like, hustle, get to where you're going. Time is money. And what you speak about in terms of capitalism being supposedly based on efficiency, on time and labor, managing labor so that, there are interchangeable units of time and, money and capital, is antithetical to a kind of wild, flourishing. It does reduce living creatures to things. It thingifies the world. It makes things into board feet, trees into board feet, animals into, ham hocks and whatever, however else you can dissect them. It's inherently sort of separating, and that is, it does work against the kind of wild wholeness that we're seeking. So I think you're right to point that out. Now, on the other hand, I should say that there are, I think, good examples of groups that do better than others. And I'm thinking of a friend of mine, Margot Farnsworth, who writes about certain companies or corporations who have used biomimicry to make their products. They've taken cues from nature, if you will, to make products better products, and it's less of an extractive relationship, and they're trying to think about how to create companies that do operate on a more closed loop model, a more reciprocal model, and so I don't want to sort of completely, go with a huge, broad brushstroke. I do think there are examples, within capitalist society that are pursuing ends that are more socially and ecologically conscious of their larger impacts and the ripple effects, and accounting for those things well within that system. I mean, a big part of it is how can you not externalize your costs and your pollution and your everything else onto a broader public, because that's what so often has happened in companies. So how can they make those things internally a closed loop, sort of system?
Thank you so much. We have at least one more. Okay, so this is a kind of a longer comment here that we sort of narrow down a bit. So Stacy says, when I think about environmental injustice, it seems almost blatant how intertwined the degradation of the land is with the historical oppression of different populations. Yeah. You mentioned Green Corps Chicago, which supports both local environmental action as well as populations of formerly incarcerated individuals. Do you imagine that if we built more systemic equity for these historically oppressed populations, the well-being of the land would follow?
Absolutely. There is no doubt. The environmental justice movement has been around. Well, I mean, you could say it's been around forever, but formally it's been around since the early 80s, making those connections, pointing out the relationship between structural racism and ecological pollution, and the ways that the most targeted neighborhoods, sometimes very intentionally, Superfund sites, water pollution, name your list of, atrocities are intentionally cited in those places. Cities have been built. I mean, pick your city and trace that history back, and you can find, the story of redlining, where neighborhoods where, systematic deinvestment from neighborhoods because Black and brown people lived there was an intentional move, and it goes hand in hand with environmental injustice. So absolutely, as you start to address those social problems, you're addressing oftentimes the environmental problems that go hand in hand with those social problems.
Okay. Well, we have one more question before we let you go. This is also from Yasmin. There's a lot of negative news bias regarding wildness. So what could be the first step to slowly turn these negative bias to positive bias, if that makes sense?
Okay. Well, I'm just trying to read into the question here, and I think maybe Yasmin is talking about, there are some connotations with wildness, like wildness is out of control, it's unruly, like I know we run across that, and we talk about that in the book sometimes. It's not always thought of as a positive thing. It's thought of as positive among certain sort of environmental circles, but wildness is also, I mean, think of your songs like Born to Be Wild with Middle Finger Freedom of riding your motorcycle off into the sunset. It's about like individualism, hyper individualism, so that might be the kind of negative side of wildness. But that's really a wildness that cuts oneself off from community, right? So in this more comprehensive sense of what we're talking about of wildness, I think lifting up those stories of like the neighborhood I mentioned with Lisa Hish, where that kind of focus on the health and well-being of the neighborhood is bringing people together in a community of co-creating those wild, more biodiverse spaces in the heart of urban areas. And so I guess to more directly answer your question, it's a matter of making those stories more visible, making them more known, putting those stories out there, writing about them, doing podcasts about them, all the ways that we, can get those stories out into the world.
Well, Gavin, I want to once again thank you all so much. Thank you so much for spending the time with us this evening. And I want to remind our viewers, both who are watching now and will be watching coming forward here, that the next event in this series will be on February 24th, which is a Friday, where Jake Blunt, who is a rising star in the music world, in fact, you could watch his NPR Tiny Desk episode that just came out, will be doing a lecture at 3 p.m. Titled Go Into the Wilderness, Black Spirituals and the Natural Environment. And then that will be followed at 8 p.m. By a concert at the Fine Arts Center at URI. The 3 p.m. Event will be live streamed as well, and that's going to be in the Higgins Welcome Center. But the concert will just be an in-person concert. So I hope that some of you can, at very least, see one of those two events. And we will have an additional event in April that we're very excited about, and the series has been a lot of fun. So once again, thank you to Gavin, and thank you to all of you, and we will see you next time. Good night.